the tribe that preserved the dead by letting them rot, inside the rituals of the Beroan Deep in the mist-covered rainforests of Borneo, where vines curl like sleeping serpents, and the air hangs heavy with the scent of damp wood. The Beroan tribe held a belief that would unsettle most of the modern world. To them, death was not a moment, it was a passage, a long, treacherous journey where the soul, if not guided carefully, could lose its way, and so they did not bury their dead swiftly. They kept them, a corpse, in Beroan tradition, was never just a body. It was a vessel still linked to the living, a presence that lingered between two worlds. The Beroan believed that if the transition to death was hurried, the soul could become stuck neither alive nor fully gone. In this twilight state, it could bring misfortune, illness, or madness upon those it once loved. Instead of sealing the dead beneath earth, they placed them in open containers, sometimes carved wooden coffins, sometimes woven bamboo platforms, and housed them in special structures near the family home. These weren't hidden away. They stood in plain sight. Rain fell on them. Heat bloated them. The smell of decomposition didn't frighten the Beroan. It reminded them that the soul was still near, still watching. For days, weeks, even years, the dead remained like this, preserved not with chemicals or stone tombs, but with time, patience, and reverence. Life in the village continued round them, shaped by the presence of those no longer breathing. Meals were eaten in quiet. Arguments were hushed. Children played under the watchful eyes of ancestors still in transition. Every moment carried the invisible weight of spirits not yet free. It wasn't seen as strange, it was sacred. The rotting of flesh, the slow fading of scent and skin, was considered necessary. It showed that the body was surrendering, that the spirit was slowly stepping away from the world of the living. The Beroan feared a clean, fast death. To them, it wasn't respectful, it was dangerous. This belief crept into the bones of their architecture. Homes were built to accommodate death, not to hide it, but to live alongside it. Platforms for bodies stood just beyond the central walls. Ritual objects like river stones and carved figures were placed near the dead to calm the spirit during its liminal state. Every structure, every space, bore the memory of someone still waiting to cross over. And this waiting was not passive. It demanded discipline. The family had to avoid certain foods. They had to refrain from joyful celebrations. Laughter could insult the soul still in pain. Everything was done with caution, reverence, and an undercurrent of fear that the spirit might return in wrath if neglected. In the Beroan world, death had no clear ending. It was a slow release, a test of faith, and a sacred responsibility. And once the final breath was taken, the true ritual had only just begun. Because for the Beroan, the dead did not rest. Not yet. In Beroan villages, the air was shared by the living and the rotting, just steps from family homes. Special structures stood like wooden guardians, coffin houses built not to seal death away, but to let it breathe. These weren't silent tombs, they were open, porous sanctuaries where decay unfolded like a ritual. The Beroan believed that for a soul to pass peacefully, the body had to decompose slowly and naturally. Any attempt to contain or hold this process was seen as interference with the spirit's sacred departure. So they designed their coffin houses with deliberate gaps in the wood, lifted floors, and airflow channels to allow heat, moisture, and time to do their work. The architecture itself became part of the ritual. Inside these shelters lay the bodies of the newly dead, wrapped in cloth, laid in carved coffins, or rested on woven mats. The scent of decomposition wasn't masked. It mingled with the jungle wind, with the smoke of cooking fires, with the scent of earth after rain. The presence of the dead wasn't a hidden truth. It was a living fact. Children were told to speak. Softly near the coffin houses, elders left offerings of food and water by the entrance, and those who visited were expected to show more than politeness, they were expected to show reverence. Any disrespect near the dead was thought to provoke spiritual unrest, a loud voice, a careless joke. Even stepping too close without permission could bring illness, nightmares, or misfortune. The soul, they believed, still lingered listening, watching, waiting. These structures reflected a worldview where death wasn't clean, clinical, or final. It was messy, sacred, and alive with meaning. The coffin houses were not just for the dead, they were reminders for the living. They taught patience, humility, and fear. They stood as quiet proof that in Berowyn culture, letting the body rot wasn't neglect, it was devotion. And when the wind passed through the wooden slats, stirring the leaves and touching the skin of the villagers, it carried more than air. It carried the breath of those not yet gone. For the Berowyn, death was not a finish line, it was a crossing full of uncertainty. Once the body was placed in its open coffin, the countdown began. A period of waiting, watching, and worrying. This vigil could stretch to 100 days, during which the corpse was not simply remembered, it was treated as both dead and alive. Every day, food was placed near the body, as though it might still feel hunger. Family members whispered to it, shared stories, or apologized for old arguments. Children were taught to speak softly and offer small gestures, folded leaves, bits of fruit, woven charms. These weren't symbolic acts, they were survival, because in Berowyn belief, a neglected corpse could do more than hunt, it could destroy. The soul of the dead, they believed, hovered dangerously close, not yet free, not yet safe. It could visit dreams, whisper unsettling words in the night, cause fevers, or even cast shadows over crops. A sudden illness or a burned roof was never just bad luck, it was often blamed on a spirit displeased with its treatment during the vigil. So families did not let the corpse go unwatched. Someone remained nearby at all hours, even through the night. Fires were lit to keep the air warm. Herbs were placed to calm the spirit's path, and silence became a language of respect. The village adapted to the mood of the dead. Weddings were postponed, celebration silenced, love and fear intertwined in every gesture. The family mourned the loss, but also feared what the soul might become if the rituals failed. Grief was complicated, not just sadness, but pressure. Every day that passed was one more step in a delicate dance with the invisible dot. It wasn't just the family who bore the burden, the whole village felt it. Neighbors left offerings of their own. Elders watched the weather for signs. Children slept with protective charms round their necks. The dead had wait even when they could, no longer speak by the final day. If no misfortune had struck, it was taken as a sign. The soul was ready to move on. But until then, everyone held their breath, because for the Berowyn, the dead did not rest peacefully, they waited, listened, and lingered in the shadows of the living. The Berowyn did not measure time by clocks or calendars, but by the scent of decay, the color of skin, and the stillness of a corpse. Only when the body had surrendered fully to rot, when the flesh no longer clung stubbornly to the bone, could the final ritual begin. It was not a burial. It was a release. This moment, long awaited, brought both relief and reverence. The body, now emptied of resistance, was gently removed from its resting platform. The family did not flinch. What outsiders might see as grotesque, they treated with tenderness. The corpse was washed in scented water, dressed in ceremonial fabrics, and adorned with charms meant to calm the spirit for its final journey. Then came the songs. Low, rhythmic chants passed down through generations, voices that trembled but did not break. Each line carried meaning, a prayer, a warning, a farewell. Dances followed slow, circular movements that mimicked the cycle of life and death. These were not performances, but acts of devotion. Every step was a bridge, every beat of the drum a guide for the soul leaving the known world. The ritual could stretch over several days. Food was offered, fires burned constantly, and sacred symbols were drawn on the burial space. Children watched, in silence. Elders spoke in low tones, reminding the spirit where it came from and where it must go. No part of the body was feared, not the exposed bone, not the hollowed eyes. All was sacred, all was necessary. At last, the body was sealed in a burial container, often the second coffin. This one meant for eternal rest and placed in the ground or hidden cave. But the ceremony didn't end there. The spirit had to be sealed off from the world of the living. Final chants closed the doorway between realms. And when the last ember faded, and the final chant dissolved into the jungle air, the Beroan did not mourn. They celebrated. The soul had crossed. The danger had passed. Peace had been, and not just for the dead, but for those they left behind. Yet, even in peace, the question lingered in the silence. What if the soul wasn't truly gone to the outside world? A hospital is a place of healing, but to many Beroan elders, it is a place of spiritual blindness, a building that forgets the soul. Within its sterile walls, they say, the most dangerous kind of death can happen. One without guidance. The Beroan believe that when death is stripped of ritual, the spirit becomes confused. Machines may keep the body breathing, but the soul grows restless and short if it's still tethered to life. Fluorescent lights, cold steel beds, and hurried staff replace the careful chants, the sacred offerings, the scent of burning herbs, and so on. When death arrives in a hospital room, the journey of the soul is left unfinished. There is no coffin house, no final bath with fragrant water. Number 100-day vigil to watch the soul take shape and direction in the Beroan worldview. This absence is not just a loss, it is a danger. A spirit without a roadmap can wander endlessly, unable to return to the ancestors or move on to the next world. Worse still, it may drift back to the village in confusion, bringing illness or misfortune in its wake. Because of this fear, many Beroan families choose to keep their sick at home, even in moments of crisis, when modern medicine could intervene. Some elders insist on staying in the village, to die surrounded by family, under the watch of ancestral spirits, is seen as far safer than dying in a place where no one knows the old ways. This belief reveals a deeper conflict between tradition and technology, between the rituals of the forest and the systems of the city. To the Beroan, a hospital may heal the body, but it silences the spirit. It replaces ritual with routine, and in doing so, it erases the sacred process that has protected their people for generations. In a world racing toward modern convenience, the Beroan hold tightly to what they fear as being lost, the invisible map that guides the soul home. But if the soul fails to find its way, what does it leave behind in the Beroan world? Not all souls find peace. Some are caught in the in-between, have gone, have here wandering the edges of the village like a shadow with no echo. These spirits are not monsters, they are mistakes, tragic results of rituals left unfinished, deaths buried too soon, or traditions broken by haste. Elders speak of them in whispers, souls that never received the final chants, the offerings, or the 100-day watch. They drift through dreams, bringing strange words and unshakable dread. Children wake screaming, saying they saw a face at the edge of the tree line. Healers are called when a sudden illness spreads through a home, blamed not on nature, but on a presence unseen. The Beruan do not fear these spirits because they are evil, they fear them because they are lost. And in their sorrow, they cling to the living, not to hurt, but to be noticed. A cold wind at noon, a rooster that refuses to crow, a fire that will not stay lit. All are read as signs that something from the other side is reaching back, not in malice, but in confusion. These souls are known as Tellen, spirits that linger. Some say they harbor near the places they once lived, drawn to familiar pots, old resting mats, or trees once planted in their honor. Others believe they hide in the coffin houses, too afraid to cross without a proper send-off. Their presence is not loud, but it is heavy. Rooms grow quiet. Conversations stop, and everyone looks behind them, just in case. When these signs appear, the village responds. Offerings of rice or salt are left at doorways. Ancestor chants are repeated, sometimes days after the funeral, in hopes of giving the lost soul a map. No one mocks these beliefs. Even those who leave for other cities return to the village if the dead begin to speak in dreams. No one takes chances with the Tellen, because in Beruan belief, the dead are not gone until they are truly remembered. Their peace depends entirely on the living. Forgetting isn't just cruel, it's dangerous. A neglected spirit is a silent intruder, slowly fraying the edges of the world it once knew. So when someone dies, it is not only grief that follows, it is responsibility. And when a shadow moves where there should be none, when the wind howls through the coffin house at night, the villagers do not sleep easy. They listen, they prepare, they remember, because the Beruan know that in their jungle, the line between the living and the lost is drawn only by care, and once that line is broken, the spirit may never find its way home. The heretics who feared the flesh, inside the twisted world of the Bogomils in the shadowed corners of 10th century Bulgaria, a doctrine began to spread, not with swords, but with whispers. The Bogomils called themselves the friends of God, but to kings and clergy, they were a blasphemous contagion. Their beliefs struck at the very roots of Christian orthodoxy, flipping heaven and hell on their heads. To the Bogomils, the visible world, trees, bodies, mountains, churches, was not created by God, but by Satan himself. They taught that the material world was a prison, and the flesh was its chains. Food, touch, birth. These were not blessings, but curses. Their faith was not one of celebration, but escape. Bogomil preachers wandered barefoot through peasant villages, warning that the crucifix was not a holy symbol, but a tool of demonic deception. They claimed the church itself was Satan's temple in disguise. Priests, in their eyes, served not Christ, but the devil. Their rejection of the material went beyond doctrine. They refused to build temples. They tore down icons. They spat on the sacraments. Even bread and wine, the sacred heart of Christian ritual, were rejected as corrupt to them. True worship required no altar, only purity of thought and the refusal of earthly ties. This was not passive belief. It was spiritual rebellion. Entire communities abandoned the authority of church and state. They refused to pay tithes. They ignored bishops. They saw kings as tyrants possessed by demons. And all the while, their numbers grew across Bulgaria, Serbia, and into the distant lands of Bosnia and Italy. The Byzantines condemned them as a cancer. The Roman Church branded them heretics. But attempts to stamp them out only spread the fire. The more they were hunted, the more their words became sacred. Their faith fed on suffering, and they welcomed it. The Bogomils were not just feared for what they believed. They were feared because they could not be controlled. No sword could cut what was already dead to the world. No prison could terrify those who saw the body as a curse in the eyes of empire. They were ghosts walking among the living, rejecting crowns, crosses, and carnal life alike. And at the center of their spiritual war was a fear deeper than death itself, the fear of the flesh in their world. Desire was a demon, and nowhere was this more violently declared than in their war against sex taught to the Bogomils. No sin screamed louder than the act of sex. In a belief system built on rejecting the body, sexual desire was not merely weakness. It was a deliberate trick of Satan. They preached that the devil created flesh to imprison the soul, and sex was his cruelest bait. Every act of intimacy was a binding contract with evil, a surrender to the trap of flesh and illusion. Marriage did not absolve this crime, even between husband and wife. Sexual union was condemned as a willful deepening of humanity's fall. Reproduction, far from being sacred, was a spiritual betrayal. To bring a child into the world was, in their eyes, to deliver another soul into the devil's domain. Birth was not a beginning, it was a capture. Every crying newborn was a sign that the prison had grown one cell larger. Celibacy was the highest virtue. Those who chose to deny their bodies were seen as warriors in the hidden war against matter. The purest among them, the perfecti, renounced not only sex, but all physical comfort. They fasted to frailty, avoided touch, and spoke rarely, fearing that even words could carry the heat of desire. Some slept on stone or dirt, shunning anything soft as indulgence. Love was permitted, but only in thought, stripped of touch, breath, and skin. Women were both feared and pitied within this worldview. Their bodies, capable of creating life, were seen as the devil's most effective weapon. Even childbirth, honored in most cultures, was viewed with sorrow. Midwives were discouraged, and pregnancy was seen as spiritual defeat. Those who abstained entirely were celebrated as heroes of the faith. These beliefs created a haunting silence around desire. In Bogomil communities, young couples lived like siblings, watched over by elders trained to detect signs of attraction. Passion was hunted like a disease. Pleasure became a whispered threat. But behind their rejection lay a deeper terror, the fear that to feel the body was to lose the soul, and so they stripped life of its warmth, believing that emptiness was the only path to purity. Yet for those who dared walk it, the path grew darker still, where even food, speech, and light became burdens too great to bear. In the world of the Bogomils, starvation was not suffering, it was salvation. Their elders, revered as spiritual guides, often chose to waste away in solitude, believing that each lost pound of flesh brought them closer to God. The less they consumed, the less they belonged to the material world. Hunger was not a sign of weakness, but of triumph over the body. Fasting became a sacred discipline. Days passed without food. Weeks turned into months of meager intake. The aim was not survival, but surrender, islow, deliberate erasure of earthly attachment. To eat was to feed the devil's creation. To resist was to starve him out of the soul. Some fasted until their vision blurred and breath thinned. To onlookers, they seemed near death. To the faithful, they were almost free. Isolation was equally exalted. The most devout Bogomils retreated into caves, forests, or stone shelters, places far from human distraction. They saw society as noise and temptation in silence. They believed truth could finally be heard. Words, in their view, were dangerous. Language was shaped by the world, and the world was shaped by evil. Speaking too often was thought to stir dark spirits buried in the tongue. Silence, therefore, became a shield. The holiest elders spoke rarely, and only in whispers. When they did, their words were measured and sparse, more gesture than speech. Conversation was viewed as indulgence, and laughter as spiritual pollution. To speak lightly was to betray the soul's battle for stillness. This devotion to silence and starvation stripped life to its rawest form, breath, bone, and thought, in denying the body. They believed they were preparing for release. Each hour of quiet hunger was a step out of Satan's maze, but for those who embraced this path fully, the body became a ghost long before death arrived, and the rituals of vanishing took on a power few outs. Either world could understand. Among the Bogomils, death was not an end. It was a doorway to be opened early, reserved only for the most devout. The ritual of spiritual death was cloaked in secrecy and dread. Few witnessed it, and those who did spoke of it in hushed tones, as if describing something not of this world. It was not a metaphor. It was a severing, a deliberate choice to die before the body ceased to live. Only the highest initiates were allowed to undergo it. In preparation, they withdrew from all contact, abandoning even the barest ties to humanity. No family, no name, no possessions, in a dim, enclosed space, often for days without food or light. They entered a trance through prayer, starvation and stillness. There, they whispered declarations that their body no longer belonged to them, that their soul had exited the flesh, and that nothing in this world held meaning. Those who emerged did so changed. Eyewitnesses described blank stares, quiet monotones, and movements stripped of emotion, as if the person had been hollowed out and replaced by something colder. These individuals no longer responded to pain, praise, or fear. They wore no expression, touched no one, and lived only to wait for physical death, which they no longer feared. Some stopped eating altogether. Others lay still for days at a time, unmoving, unblinking, present, yet utterly absent. In Bogomil belief, this was the highest achievement, to exist in the world without being part of it. To kill the self while the body still breathed. They were not saints or prophets. They were ghosts with skin to the outside world. They appeared broken, but to the Bogomils, they had finally escaped. Their souls had walked out of the devil's cage and left only a shell behind. And for those who remained behind, one final weapon of resistance still remained. Not war or fire, but whispered prayer, hurled like stones into the dark. For the Bogomils, prayer was not comfort, it was confrontation. They believed the churches of Europe had been hijacked by the devil, and that every hymn, every candle, every cross in those sanctuaries served darkness, not light. To speak God's name inside a cathedral was, in their eyes, to whisper in Satan's ear. So they abandoned the altars and turned instead to wild places, windswept hills, empty caves, or the stillness beneath trees. There, in silence and shadow, they spoke to what they called the invisible God, a divine presence untouched by matter, form, or ritual. Their prayers were stripped of liturgy, raw and whispered like secrets. They believed that by rejecting the devil's physical world, each word cut deeper into evil's reign. Prayer became their weapon. They wielded it not to beg, but to resist. Words were spoken slowly, deliberately, meant to wound unseen forces that surrounded them. These invocations were believed to weaken demons, dissolve spiritual corruption, and shield the soul from the devil's grip. To the faithful, a single true prayer had the power to shake the darkness. To outsiders, these practices appeared strange, even dangerous. No churches, no relics, no priests. Only small gatherings of believers, faces turned to the sky or buried in the earth, whispering words no one else could hear. It resembled not religion, but rebellion, a kind of sacred sabotage. Yet their faith did not end with whispers when captured. Some Bogomils met execution without fear. For them, fire was not destruction, it was release. because the only thing more powerful than their prayer was how they chose to die. When church authorities captured Bogomils, punishment was swift and merciless. Torture chambers echoed with cries of those accused of heresy, and fire was the preferred sentence. But what unnerved inquisitors most was not the defiance. It was the calm. Many Bogomils went to the flames without pleading, without weeping. Some even smiled. They did not see execution as terror. They saw it as freedom. To them, the body was a prison built by Satan, and fire was the key that unlocked the soul. Each lash of the whip, each turn of the rack, was believed to weaken the devil's hold. Death by fire was not feared, it was honored. They believed the flames could burn away the last remnants of the material world, leaving the soul untouched and rising. Some were offered mercy, a chance to recant and be spared, but many refused, declaring that survival was not salvation. They saw earthly rescue as betrayal of the truth. Their silence under torture became legend, their peace in execution almost inhuman. Even executioners, hardened by years of cruelty, hesitated at the sight of such unnatural serenity. These burnings were meant to break their faith, but instead they became its proof. As flames consumed their bodies, the Bogomils believed they were finally severing the last tie to Satan's world. For them, death was not defeat, it was their final sermon, and so the fires meant to erase their beliefs only made their story burn brighter, a faith built on rejection, silence, and spiritual rebellion, leaving behind ash, whispers, and a legacy that still disturbs centuries later. The island where pain was a blessing. Inside the secret rituals of the Bubi tribe high in the mist-covered hills of Bioko Island, surrounded by thick forests and jagged cliffs, lived a tribe that time refused to tame. The Bubi people did not welcome strangers. They did not share their songs or stories. What little the world knows of them comes in whispers about rituals buried in secrecy and pain passed down like a sacred inheritance. For the Bubi, the world beyond their island was not just unknown, it was dangerous. Outsiders brought disruption, questions, weakness, and so, for generations, the tribe vanished into the jungle, building a world of silence, shadows, and spiritual fire. Every child born was a vessel for ancient memory. Every scream was a betrayal of the ancestors. Pain was not punishment. It was purification. Fire was not feared, it was revered. In Bubi belief, the soul was covered in layers of earthly filth at birth. Only suffering could peel those layers away. Boys were taught early. To cry was to curse your blood. Girls were warned that even grief must be silent, or the spirits might steal the voice forever. Their gods lived in trees, their ghosts in the wind, and their laws were enforced not with written rules, but with wounds carved deep into skin and memory. If a man disrespected a sacred site, his feet might be bound with vines soaked in fire sap. If a woman questioned an elder's wisdom, her meals might be withheld until her silence returned. No act of rebellion went unnoticed, no disobedience unmarked. The tribe's most sacred belief held that ancestors watched from beneath the soil, listening to every word, every breath, judging not by what was done, but by what was felt. Thoughts were never private. Guilt, even unspoken, was said to rot the body from within. That fear shaped a community where smiles were rare and silence was gold. Their punishments were not always visible. Some were spiritual exiles rituals, where a person was made invisible to the community, treated as if dead, even as they walked among the living. Others endured what the tribe called the burning of the soul, a rite involving smoke, chants, and as pressed against the chest, until visions came, visions that either healed or destroyed to outsiders. These customs seemed brutal, even inhuman. But to the Bubi, they were acts of love, devotion to a lineage that lived forever in the bones of the land. purity wasn't a choice, it was a debt, among the Bubi of Bioko Island. Pain was never just pain. It was a language, a vow, a passage, written in flesh for those stepping into adulthood. No ritual loomed larger than the burnt arms. It was not a choice. It was a demand from the spirits and from the bloodlines that lived within each child's bones. At the age when voice begins to deepen and childhood begins to fade, boys and girls were brought before the elders, their arms stretched bare beneath the open sky. Were seen as scrolls waiting to be written, smooth river stones, heated over sacred flame, were placed upon their skin with slow, deliberate weight. Not once, but again and again, each presser. Message to the ancestors, this one is willing, this one is strong. No screams were allowed, no tears were welcome. The only sound permitted was silence. To cry out, even in agony, was seen as weakness and insult to the spirits who had endured far worse. A single whimper could mean years of shame. Entire families could be marked as dishonored. Their crops cursed, their children whispered about. In ritual gatherings, the scars that remained were not hidden. They were worn with pride, etched lines that twisted across forearms, often in spirals or streak burns, became permanent symbols of spiritual endurance among the Bubi. A scarless arm was not innocent, it was empty. A person without marks was a person without strength, without loyalty, without belonging. This ritual did more than test the body. It rewired the mind. It taught that pain was a companion, not an enemy, that to suffer was to ascend, and that the deeper the burn, the stronger the bond to those who came before. The burnt arms were not merely a ritual. They were a contract, one sealed in heat, in silence, and in scars that never faded. But among the Bubi, some scars did not come from fire. Some were born of silence far colder and punishments far more haunting. In Bubi tradition, childbirth was not just a beginning, it was a moment suspended between life and the unseen, especially during sacred lunar cycles. When the moon turned red, all vanished completely. Birth was seen as a fertile crossing between two worlds, and in those rare nights, the mother's voice became forbidden for 30 days. Women who gave birth under these celestial signs were bound to silence. No words, no songs, not even a whisper to the newborn in her arms. The tribe believed the child's soul was not fully rooted in the body during this phase. It wandered between realms, watched by ancestors, tested by spirits, deciding whether to stay or return to the unseen. A mother's voice, however loving, could pull the soul back too soon, or frighten it into leaving forever. Silence became her prayer, her protection, her burden. During this sacred silence, family members spoke for her, cared for her, and watched closely for signs of weakness. A single slip, a gasp, a cry in sleep. A murmured name could shatter the ritual. Such violations carried a deep spiritual cost. Some women were forced into purification rites that involved isolation in cold huts, fasting for days, and enduring chants that accused the spirit of disobedience. Others faced quiet punishment, social exile, meals brought late, greetings left unanswered, eyes that refused to meet hers. To break the vow of silence was to betray the tribe's bond with the spirit world. It meant risking not just her own soul but her child's. Some mothers never fully returned from this silence. Even after the 30 days had passed, their voices remained soft, hesitant, cracked by unseen guilt. The tribe never demanded forgiveness, only obedience, and in that space between tradition and trauma, the ritual etched itself into the mind as deeply as any scar ever did into flesh. For the Bubi, motherhood was not just biological, it was spiritual endurance. But even that silence could not compare to the quiet dread that surrounded their most feared judgment. Not by people, but by nature itself. Deep within the dense jungles of Bioko Island stood a tree unlike any other. Tall, gnarled, and veiled in vines, the Bubi called it the Tree of Judgment. Its bark bore the marks of time and trembling hands. No one carved its name, yet every soul in the tribe knew its power. It did not speak, but it decided fates. When conflict broke out, accusations of theft, betrayal, adultery, there were no trials, no testimonies. The accused were taken to the sacred tree, bound tightly by woven cords, and left to the jungle. No food, no water, only time and the unseen spirits who whispered through rustling leaves and crawling insects. Justice in the Bubi world did not come from people. It came from nature, the spirits of the forest. They believed, could see truth where human eyes failed, and so the tribe watched from a distance, waiting for signs: an owl landing on a branch, a swarm of ants retreating, a leaf falling in a strange direction. Each omen carried a message. Each motion was a verdict. If a sign came quickly and in the accused's favor, they were untied and cleansed with ritual smoke, their name restored, their honor renewed. But if the jungle remained still, the silence itself became judgment. Hours turned into days. The vines round their wrists tightened as the sun burned, and the thirst deepened. For some, the body gave out before the spirits ever did. Survival was rare, and even for those who endured. Returning to the village meant more than physical recovery. The mind was often broken by the isolation, the fear, the waiting. The tree did not leave wounds on the skin it carved its mark into the soul. To the Bubi, this was sacred law. To question the tree's decision was to challenge the spirits themselves. There were no appeals, no forgiveness, only the belief that nature never lies. But nature's judgment did not end with the living. Even death had rules, and breaking them invited consequences that reached into the realm of the dead, where spirits clung to what the tribe feared most, the hair of the mourner's daughter among the Bubi. Death did not end with the burial. It hovered, it lingered, and it hid in the strands of the living. The tribe believed that the spirit of the departed clung to the hair of the mourners especially, those closest by blood, for 91 days after a funeral. No one was allowed to cut, wash, or even brush their hair. To disturb a single strand was to disturb the dead. It was said that spirits, disoriented after leaving the body, latched onto the hair of the living in search of comfort, but if shaken or pulled away too soon, the spirit could become enraged, bringing sickness, madness, or worse. Entire villages observed the mourning law. Men let their braids knot and twist. Women wore their hair heavy and tangled, shielding it beneath cloth, afraid even the wind might offend the invisible guest. Children were warned not to touch their mother's head, not even in play. Every home held its breath. Breaking the taboo was a grave risk. A simple comb through the scalp could awaken what the Bubi called the angry sleeper state, where the spirit returned in dreams, whispering confusion, causing sudden illness, or shadowing the mourner for a life. Some who violated the law were taken to spiritual healers. There, they were washed in black herbs and covered in clay to seal the soul's entry points. But not all were cured. Fear fed discipline, and the silence of mourning became more than grief. It was survival. During the 91 days, even laughter was frowned upon. The dead were to be remembered through quiet, stillness, and respect. Any joy was seen as selfish, as betrayal, and when the final day arrived, a cleansing ceremony was held. Hair was cut not with metal blades, but with sharpened shells passed down through generations. Only then, under the watch of elders and spirits alike, could life resume. But for those raised with these beliefs, the fear never fully vanished, because if spirits could hide in hair, What else might be watching in the shadows of daily life? Among the Bubi, discipline was never left to chance. Fear wasn't a tactic, it was tradition. And perhaps nothing embodied that fear more than the soul stones, smooth, dark, and palm-sized. These stones were no ordinary objects. Each one was said to hold the gaze of a dead elder. Sealed during a ritual involving ash, breath, and whispered names, once created, the soul stone was handed down through generations, guarded like a living elm. But these stones were not displayed. They were hidden beneath beds, behind doors, or wrapped inside mats where only the guilty knew to look. For children who disobeyed or spoke out of turn, the punishment came at night. As they lay in silence, unaware or half asleep, the soul stone would be slipped beneath their sleeping mat. It was believed that the spirit inside could watch dreams, read secret thoughts, and carry them to the realm of the dead. By morning, the child would wake pale, shaken, afraid to speak. No cries were heard during these nights, just silence and the heaviness of being seen by something they could not see back. Among elders, the stones were sacred tools. They did not punish with hands, they let the spirits decide. If a child continued to misbehave after the soul stone had visited, it was seen not as defiance, but spiritual danger. The child would then be taken for cleansing, a ritual that included isolation. Snook bats and whispered chants meant to sever ties with the watching ancestor. The soul stones weren't just for children. Adults too were reminded of their presence. A misplaced object, a sudden illness, an unlucky harvest, any misfortune could be blamed on the return of an unhappy gaze. The stones created an invisible court of ancestors, always watching, always listening. In Bubi belief, nothing was ever truly forgotten. Every action left a shadow. Every thought echoed into the spirit world, and in this world ruled by silence, scars, and the supernatural. Discipline was woven into the very fabric of childhood. Even in sleep, there was no escape, not from the guilt, not from the watchers, not from the stones. And while the body could survive the burn, and the voice could survive the silence, it was the feeling of always being seen that remained the most haunting of all. The Cloud People's darkest secrets, inside the bone rituals of the Chachapoy high in the jagged spine of the Andes, where clouds crawl like ghosts across the cliffs. A forgotten people once built cities in the sky. The Chachapoy, known to outsiders as the Cloud People, were more than just a highland tribe. They were a civilization carved into mist and stone, where death was not the end, but a sacred beginning. Their enemies feared them. Even the mighty Inca spoke their name with unease. Isolated by sheer rock walls and draped in fog, the Chachapoy lived in vertical worlds, entire villages perched on ledges, stairways etched into stone faces, tombs stacked like silent warnings above the abyss. What they left behind was not just architecture. It was a blueprint for how the dead could rule the living. In Chachapoy belief, the dead were never gone. Ancestors remained guardians, judges, and witnesses. To die was to join the mountain itself, and to live among its ghosts. Mummified remains were not hidden underground. They were seated upright in cliffside sarcophagi, stone tombs like balconies, gazing forever across the valleys, wrapped in layers of linen and earth pigments, their faces frozen in quiet watchfulness. These mummies were placed so high they could only be seen from below, an eternal reminder that the ancestors were always watching. But these were not passive relics. The Chachapoy believed that death carried energy. The bones of the dead held power, memory, and even warnings. If neglected, the ancestors could curse the crops, sicken the children, or summon storms across the mountains. Each skull, each spine, each brittle hand curled into cloth was part of a spiritual chain, linking the living to the unseen world in a ritual of constant care and fear. Offerings were made at the tombs. Dried meats, blood-soaked cloth, herbs burned to send smoke into the heavens. Some say the voices of the dead could be heard in the wind, a soft chattering across the cliffs. Like whispers carried from bone to bone, to disturb the dead was a sacred crime. But to forget them was worse. Children were taught to speak the names of the ancestors as prayers. Warriors carried relics of their fallen bloodline into battle. A people held together by stone and silence. The Chachapoya built not for themselves, but for those who had already crossed into the mist. And in the rare air above the clouds, one truth reigned. The higher the tomb, the closer the soul to the gods. But some souls, they believed, could still bleed, and not all were at peace. To outsiders, it would have looked like blasphemy. Bones unearthed, broken, painted, bled. But for the Chachapoya, this was not desecration. It was a sacred act of cleansing, a ritual as vital as breath itself. The bone purge was no mere burial rite. It was a reckoning between the living and the dead. Each year, when the mountain winds changed and the mists thickened over the cliffs, the tribe gathered in silence. Tombs, some perched so high they required ropes and ladders, were opened with trembling hands inside. The ancestors waited, wrapped in centuries-old cloth, their skeletal frames twisted with time. But silence was not respect. Stillness was not safety. The Chachapoya believed that spirits could rot from within, that hatred, grief, and betrayal could ferment in the bones long after flesh was gone. So the bones were removed, femurs and skulls. Rib cages and brittle finger joints laid bare. Beneath the sun, the first step was washing. Herbs, oils, and rainwater poured over every fragment. Then came the blood. From animal sacrifice or ritual wounds, it was believed that fresh blood awakened memory. Cracks in skulls were filled with red dye, and sometimes real blood, smeared like ink across ancient bone. A ritual knife might be used to reopen fractures, not to harm, but to let trapped evil escape. What mattered was the release. Cracking a bone allowed grief to exit. Painting it bound the spirit back into balance. In some cases, bones were even reshaped, sanded, or buried again in a new position, as if the dead were being taught to rest properly. Like children corrected by elders, some were moved entirely. Separated from others, a soul believed to be tainted could not remain beside the pure. For the Chachapoya, these rituals were not morbid, they were protective. The idea that evil could sleep inside a parent's bones and pass that evil down like a sickness haunted their worldview. Cleansing the dead meant protecting the unborn. Letting spirits fester was an invitation for droughts, madness, and even unexplained deaths. To touch a bone was to carry a prayer. To break it was to save a life. And while most tribes sealed their tombs to keep the dead away, the Chachapoya opened theirs again and again, because sometimes the past had to bleed to protect the future. But when blood alone wasn't enough, they turned to more desperate measures, like making sure the dead never opened their eyes again. Among the Chachapoya, death was never silent. Every corpse held a gaze, not of peace, but of memory, a gaze that, if left open, could follow the living back into their homes, into their dreams, into their blood. Mummified with care, but never without fear, the bodies of the dead were bound not just by cloth, but by control. And the eyes were the first to be sealed. It began with thread. A sharp needle passed through the fragile lids, pulling them closed in tight. Deliberate stitches, the threads, often colored black or red, were not for decoration. They were wards. A sewn I meant a silenced witness. It meant that the spirit trapped behind it could no longer see, could no longer find its way back for those deemed particularly dangerous, murderers, betrayers, or those who died with unresolved rage. Thread was not enough. A thick, dark pitch made from resin and ash was melted and poured into the sockets. This hardened seal was believed to blind the spirit completely, turning its vision inward, where it would be forced to relive its sins rather than haunt the world it left behind. These were not arbitrary superstitions. The Chachapoya believed in vengeful return, the idea that certain souls could not rest and would search for the ones who wronged them. They would whisper in the wind, strike down crops, drive loved ones to madness. Blinding the dead was an act of mercy to the living. Even family members, if suspected of dying with bitterness in their hearts, could not be trusted. A beloved uncle, a mourned child, if their death came with pain or betrayal, their eyes would be sealed like any other. Death did not cleanse character, it only preserved it, sometimes. Rows of mummies with their eyes sewn shut were placed, facing out toward valleys or cliff pots, not as guardians, but as prisoners, their bodies warned travelers, their blind stares offering both protection and caution. Do not forget the rules. Do not disturb the balance. To blind a spirit was not cruelty. It was defense. It was survival. And in a world where the dead were everywhere, sitting in tombs, standing in dreams, there could be no risk of being seen. But not all remains were left seated in cliffs. Some heads were taken down and hung for all to see. Not all who died among the Chachapoya were given tombs. Some were given trees. Some were lifted on poles, and some, stripped of flesh, hollowed by time, were placed in towers of bone. To the modern eye, it might resemble a battlefield trophy, but to the Cloud people, a skull on display was not a sign of death. It was a vessel of power. In the most sacred sites, long before stone walls began to crumble, rows of skulls lined ceremonial pots, hung with fiber ropes or nestled into wooden racks. These heads faced the wind, the sun, and the spirits that moved through both. They weren't always enemies. Sometimes they were elders, sometimes chosen children, but each one held a purpose far greater than remembrance. The Chachapoya believed the human head was a container, not just of thought, but of spirit after death. The skull retained echoes of the soul's energy, strength, wisdom, fertility, or even vengeance could linger in the bone. By hanging the head, that energy was released into the air, spreading like invisible protection over the tribe. During certain festivals, women hoping to conceive might touch the hanging skulls for blessing. Farmers prayed to them. Before planting, warriors asked for courage. The bones became silent mediators between the mortal and the divine, worn smooth by wind and fingers, by generations asking for what the flesh could no longer offer. But not all skulls were honored. Some were feared. If a soul had been especially potent in life, a shaman, a murderer, or someone who died in a trance, their skull was isolated, hung in trees alone, high above the ground. This wasn't reverence, it was containment. The head was kept aloft to prevent the spirit from seeping into the soil, from tainting the living with its wild or wounded energy. Towering arrangements of skulls were also used as warnings, placed at the edges of sacred cliffs or on high ridges. They told passers-by, "This land is watched. This land is protected by the dead. Step lightly, or not at all." In the Chachapoya world, the living carried the body, but the head carried the soul, and when a spirit refused to fade, the tribe didn't bury it. They raised it for all to see. Yet some fates were worse than being displayed. Some were sealed alive, wrapped in silence before death could come. Among the Chachapoya, not all were granted the right to die. Some were sentenced to vanish, to become symbols, not spirits. Legends whispered of a punishment so feared, so final. It erased a person from both the world of the living and the realm of the dead. This was not execution. This was transformation. A soul made into a warning for the most cursed, traitors, taboo breakers, or those believed to carry dangerous spirits. Death did not come by blade or poison. It came by cloth. These outcasts were wrapped alive, slowly and deliberately, into the same fetal position used for the honored dead. Their limbs folded, their heads bowed, their breath trembling. Beneath each tightening layer of linen and fiber, the chamber prepared for them was no tomb of glory. It was dug low into the cliff, cold and airless. The body was surrounded by ash, herbs, and resin meant to dry the flesh, preserve the skin, and silence the soul. No prayers were spoken. No names were carved. The chamber was sealed while breath still stirred inside. To be mummified alive was not only to suffer, it was to be erased. The Chachapoya believed that such a death prevented the soul from rising, from being remembered, from ever joining the ancestors above. It was exile not just from society, but from eternity. A soul wrapped in life became a prisoner in death, trapped between two worlds with no path to either. These rare punishments were never witnessed, only hinted at in oral tradition. Some believe these mummified outcasts were hidden deep in the cliffs, away from the sacred tombs, away from the bones that still received offerings. Others say they were buried face down, their mouths stuffed with leaves to prevent final screams from escaping into the air. To become a mummy in life was to become a curse in stillness, a presence feared, forgotten, and left without name. But while some were silenced before death, others continued to speak long after, their bones still whispering, still bleeding, still watched by a tribe that believed the dead could never truly rest. For the Chachapoya, death was never still. It shifted, circled, demanded action. The dead were not mourned and forgotten. They were managed, feared, and constantly watched. Each ritual, each act of preservation or punishment was not just spiritual tradition, it was a defense system. Ancestral worship ran deep. But it was never soft. The living kept their place through obedience to the dead, offering food, blood, and attention to avoid the wrath that could strike from beyond. A forgotten ancestor might curse the harvest. A wrongly buried body might summon illness. Every skull left in the open, every tomb built into stone. These were acts of control. The tribe believed that power moved in both directions between the living and the departed. And if one side broke the rules, the other responded. This created a culture where fear itself became a tool. Death was not just mocked, it was weaponized. Bones were cleansed like wounds. Eyes were sewn shut like prison doors. Mummification wasn't always sacred. Sometimes it was used to erase. Every ritual layered with urgency. Every act carried a warning. Even now, the legacy lingers, the cliffside tombs, built into vertical walls of remote mountains, remain mostly untouched, unreachable by ordinary means. Centuries later, they seem less like graves and more like watchtowers. The dead still gaze down on the land, still hidden, still protected. The Chachapoya fought death with death. They transformed burial into warcraft, mourning into strategy, and in doing so, they created a world where dying was only the beginning, a world still veiled in cloud, still whispering, still watching. Their secrets remain suspended in stone, not lost, but waiting. Painted for death, inside the terrifying rituals of the Chimbu tribe in the mist-covered highlands of Papua New Guinea, where the jungle hums with secrets and rivers run like veins through ancient soil. A tribe walks between the living and the dead. The Chimbu, also known as the Simbu, are not remembered for their language or their myths. They are remembered for their bones. White clay streaks across chests like broken ribs. Charcoal darkens eye sockets into black holes. Limbs are painted to look decayed and brittle. At night, when fires are low and the fog clings to the trees, these painted warriors emerge, not as men, but as skeletons. To outsiders, it looks like a ghost story stepping out of the shadows. But to the Chimbu, this is survival. The tradition was born from conflict, not ceremony. When rival tribes threatened their land, the Chimbu turned fear into a weapon. The skeletal appearance was designed to strike terror into enemies, to confuse, to haunt, to paralyze. A man who looks like death is harder to fight. A ghost cannot bleed. His spirit cannot be killed. But this ritual of bone paint goes deeper than war. In Chimbu belief, the spirit world is not above or below. It is beside. The dead walk close, always watching. Spirits can possess, punish, and curse. To become a skeleton is also to mirror the ancestors, to earn their favor, to become untouchable. It is both disguise and devotion. Honor and offering. Our children learn this early. They watch their fathers smear the bone paint and vanish into the trees. They hear the screams in the distance. They understand that fear in their world is not just a reaction. It is a tool. And for the Chimbu, there is no greater weapon than becoming what others most fear. Death itself. Even in modern times, images of these painted warriors have circled the globe, drawing photographers and researchers into the highlands. But what they capture in still frames cannot reveal the true purpose. This isn't art. It's memory. It's resistance. A ritual born from wounds to deep, to forget dot behind the bone-white masks. The eyes still burn. The soul still trembles. The Chimbu have turned the human body into a ghost, not to escape death, but to command it. And in a place where spirits never sleep, this transformation is only the beginning, because in the Chimbu Highlands, fear is not only worn, it is hunted. And when the tribe suspects a hidden danger within their own, the painted warriors are no longer the most terrifying thing in the jungle. The jungle doesn't echo like an open field. It swallows sound, chokes light, and keeps its secrets buried beneath vines and shadow. In this world, the Chimbu warrior moves unseen, not with stealth, but with silence wrapped in death. Covered in bone paint, his body becomes a message carved into flesh. Beware, the dead are watching. White clay is crushed and mixed with water until it forms a thick paste. Black ash is gathered from sacred fires, believed to hold the breath of ancestors. The two are layered onto the skin with precision, painting over muscle and life until only bones remain. Spine, ribs, jaw, all outlined to mimic the skeleton. When they move through the trees, they do not walk like men. They float like spirits. This is not costume. It is camouflage, spiritual and psychological. To the Chimbu, battle is never just a clash of weapons. It is a test of fear. A warrior who looks like a ghost gains power before the fight even begins. The enemy sees not a man, but something cursed, something untouchable. But this ritual does more than terrify human foes. In Chimbu belief, the world after death is always near. Spirits wander, whisper, punish. If a man enters a place of danger, he must protect not just his body, but his soul. The bone paint creates a mask, one that deceives the spirits into thinking he is one of them. Spirit will not harm its own. A ghost will not curse what is already dead at night. When the bone-painted warriors gather, their outlines vanish into the darkness. Only their white skeletons glow faintly in the firelight. Like warnings written in the air, they chant, not for victory, but for invisibility, for power in shadow, for safety in fear. To outsiders, the ritual may look like theater, but in the Chimbu Highlands, it is survival, it is identity. It is the memory of every war lost and every ancestor unburied. And as the warriors step deeper into the trees, their bodies may be painted for war, but their souls are painted for something far older. Because to walk as the dead is not to surrender life, it is to control the boundary between. Worlds. In the Chimbu Highlands, death rarely visits without suspicion. A sudden illness, a failed harvest, a child born still. These are not misfortunes, they are messages, and someone must be blamed. In this ancient landscape of spirits and shadow, belief in Songuma, sorcery, runs like a river beneath the surface of everyday life. The accused are almost always women, a widow living alone, a midwife whose patients died, a quiet neighbor who watched too closely. Any of them can become a target. Accusation doesn't need proof. It only needs fear. Whispers begin in the dark, and by morning, the entire village knows. The woman becomes a threat to the living, a vessel for the dead, once labeled as Songuma. There is no trial. What follows is punishment disguised as justice. The accused is dragged from her home, sometimes naked, sometimes bound. Her hair is pulled, her skin cut. Hot knives are pressed against her body to draw out the spirits. Beatings, burnings, and forced confessions follow. Her screams are swallowed by the jungle, or answered with cheers. The belief is not metaphorical. Many in the tribe truly think these women consume hearts, curse crops, or summon sickness with a glance. Death alone cannot cleanse the danger. The witch must suffer. Her blood must touch the earth. Traditional leaders often turn away. Elders claim it is a matter of custom. Even modern law holds little weight in these remote places. Silence becomes protection, not for the accused, but for the community. Fear binds them together more tightly than truth ever could. But what makes this ritual even more terrifying is how ordinary it feels to those involved. Children watch, friends participate. Sons may strike their own mothers if they believe the spirit demands it. The violence is not hidden. It is embraced. It is passed down to the outside world. These witch hunts are crimes. To the Chimbu who believe, they are necessary cleansing rituals. Brutal, yes, but sacred. And in this belief lies the deepest horror. That even today, women can be burned alive not for what they've done, but for what others fear they might be. Because in the Chimbu Highlands, spirits are always near, and when death knocks early, someone must answer. The painted warriors may wear the image of death, but it is the witch who bleeds for it. In Chimbu belief, the dead are never silent. They whisper through dreams, hide in shadows, and watch every action of the living. Ancestors are not memories, they're judges, and to forget them, even for a moment, is to risk everything. An unspoken insult, a broken promise, or a funeral, done improperly, can trigger a chain of misfortune. Crops fail without reason. Livestock dies in the night. Children fall ill with no cure. These are not accidents, they are warnings. The spirits are displeased. Families carry these burdens in silence, terrified of naming the real cause. To speak the name of an angry ancestor without ritual is to invite their full wrath. Madness may come next, a child wandering into fire, a man waking up screaming every night. The punishment spreads, sometimes for generations, until the debt is paid. The only path to forgiveness is sacrifice. A pig's throat must be slit, its blood offered to the earth while elders chant the names of the dead. Sometimes the family must fast, sleep apart, or isolate the offender for days, not as punishment, but as purification. Only then might the spirits release their grip. These rituals are not optional. They are protection. To live without them is to walk without a shadow, without safety. Even joy must be careful. A wedding, a birth, a celebration, all must first ask permission from the ones buried in the ground. Because in Chimbu life, the dead do not rest. They remember, they judge, and they do not forgive. Justice in the Chimbu Highlands is not found in courts or written in law. It lives in memory, in wounds that never closed, in names spoken with clenched teeth. When blood is spilled, it calls for more blood. Not today, not always tomorrow, but eventually, because in Chimbu belief, a life taken must be balanced, not forgiven. A single act of violence can ignite decades of retaliation. One brother killed in a land dispute. One cousin ambushed during a hunting trip. One elder insulted during a funeral. Right. These moments fracture entire communities. Families split into warring clans, and children grow up not learning to forgive, but to wait. Every wedding, every market trip, every shared path through the jungle becomes a place of risk. Sons inherit their father's enemies like they inherit his name. Even when years pass, and the original killers are gone, their blood still demands payment. A man may never meet the person he must one day kill. Only know that the debt remains. His father was wronged. His uncle was shamed. And that shame must be answered. Attempts at peace exist, but they are fragile. Ceremonies of reconciliation involve sacred pig exchanges, public apologies, and ritual speech from elders. But even these can fail if a gift is too small, or an apology feels empty. Old anger awakens. The ceremony becomes another insult, another wound. This code of vengeance is not lawless. It is governed by custom, by rules and obligations that everyone understands, but it is relentless. A mistake made by one man can curse 100 others. To live in this system is to carry every ancestor's pain like a burden across the shoulders, and so silence spreads. Words are measured, roads are avoided, eyes do not meet, because in the Chimbu world, death is not the end of conflict. It is the beginning of a promise, one that can only be answered in blood. Manhood in the Chimbu Highlands is not reached with age. It is earned through terror, before a boy is trusted to carry a spear or speak at a gathering. He must first pass through death, not literal death, but something far more haunting. He must walk the edge of the spirit world and return changed. The ritual begins with separation. A boy is taken from his family and led into the forest by elders. No comfort, no warning, no promise of when he'll return. He is stripped of food, stripped of light, and painted with bone-white clay, the same paint worn by warriors before battle. His face becomes a skull. His body becomes a ghost for hours, sometimes days. He remains in darkness, alone or among others, but always silent. Hunger gnaws at his stomach, fear creeps in. The jungle speaks in unfamiliar sounds, branches cracking, whispers in the wind, the imagined footsteps of something not human. Elders say these are the spirits of the underworld testing the boy's soul. If he breaks, he is not ready. If he endures, he is reborn. This symbolic death is more than tradition. It is spiritual armor. The Chimbu believe that only those who have touched the realm of spirits and returned can protect the tribe from the invisible threats that move in the night. Weakness invites curses. Doubt invites possession. The initiation is a shield, made of fear, carved into memory. Once the isolation ends, the boy emerges in silence. No celebration waits for him. Only the quiet nods of elders and the hard eyes of men who endured the same. He is no longer seen as a child. He is now a vessel of strength, molded by suffering. The fear that once controlled him has become part of him, a tool to be wielded, not a shadow to flee. There are no shortcuts, no escape. Every warrior was once a painted boy shivering in the dark, facing things no outsider will ever see. This is how the Chimbu forged protectors, through starvation, through silence, through simulated death, and in a tribe where spirits never sleep and enemies wear bone for skin. Fear is not something to avoid. It is something to master, because only those who have died in the eyes of the tribe are trusted to keep the living safe from the dead. The Iceblood trials, disturbing beliefs and brutal customs of the Chukchi tribe in the farthest reaches of Siberia, where the air slices skin and daylight is swallowed by months of dark. A tribe carved survival out of ice. The Chukchi people, wrapped in reindeer pelts and silence, lived where even breath seemed to freeze midair. Here, blood could stiffen in seconds, and strength was measured not by warmth, but by what the body could endure without it. This wasn't just cold. It was a world where death walked beside the living, and spirits were never far behind. Every Chukchi child knew the land didn't forgive weakness. From the earliest years, boys were trained to stare into storms without blinking, while girls were taught to serve spirits more than family. Kindness was a luxury, pain was a teacher, and belief was survival. Reindeer were not only food, warmth, and travel. They were sacred beings, tied to the gods of snow and wind. Before a hunt, Chukchi elders would press bone knives against their own chests and spill a thin line of blood onto the frozen ground. The blood was not wasted. It was an offering to the forces that ruled the tundra, the ones that decided who would return alive. Those who died were not simply buried. Corpses were dismembered and ranged in circular patterns believed to mirror the cycle of rebirth. Bones were sometimes crushed and scattered across the ice to confuse malevolent spirits that fed on tea. He dead, flesh, in certain rare cases, was fed to dogs, not as insult, but as a ritual link between human and beast, both seen as guardians of the spirit world. The Chukchi saw the body as temporary, but the soul as hunted prey. Death chants, whispered over open fire and frozen skin, were crafted to summon ancestors or warn the gods of an approaching soul. The chants were filled with images of reindeer running into the sky, rivers of blood turning into stars and frozen, hearts cracking open like stone dot to the outside world. These customs seemed brutal, but to the Chukchi, they were sacred tools against a universe that never softened. In the howl of the wind, they heard the voice of the spirit realm, in each drop of spilled blood. They saw a bargain struck with death itself, and for those not strong enough to make that bargain, the tundra always had its own rituals waiting. Now, the ice grows still, and a deeper silence descends, for in this world, even the dead have rules, and the living must follow them. In the Chukchi world, death was not an ending. It was a negotiation. When a body fell cold, the tribe did not weep, they prepared. The dead were not laid to rest in silence or wrapped in ceremonial cloth. Instead, their flesh was peeled from bone, stripped away by stone blades or sharpened antlers, guided by hands that did not tremble. This was excarnation, a ritual born of frost, belief, and the need to protect the soul from wandering. To allow a body to rot in the earth was to risk spiritual corruption. It was believed that decay lured in hungry spirits, shadow things that fed on human sorrow and stole souls before they could return to the ancestors. Stripping the flesh was a way to interrupt this process, to sever the body's weakness from the soul's journey. The bones were buried deep in layers of permafrost, stacked in sacred spirals. But the flesh had purpose in times of famine or fierce winter. It was given to sled dogs, the tribe's lifeline across endless snow. These animals were not just beasts of burden. They were spiritual companions. Sharing human flesh with them wasn't taboo. It was respect. A sacrifice made in death to preserve life. No cries marked this offering, only chants, the voices of the living called to the sky, asking the winds to carry the soul safely and the bones to remember their name. Each body was treated according to status. Warriors might have bones painted with reindeer blood. Shamans were buried with talismans carved from their own ribcage. Outsiders recoiled at these rites. But to the Chukchi, the act was sacred. The soul needed to be released. The body claimed of its earthly weight. Letting the flesh rot was worse than cruelty. It was betrayal. In a land ruled by ice. Time did not forgive the unburied, and so the Chukchi became guardians of decay itself, ensuring that even in death, their people served the living and honored the invisible. The dead had given their flesh. Now it was the living who would give their blood. At the edge of the tundra, where the cold breath of the earth turned skin to stone, a boy stood with nothing but a bone knife in his hand and frost settling in his lashes. No farewell, no warmth, just the silence of the elders watching from behind reindeer hide tents. He was 9, maybe 10, but in the eyes of the tribe, a boy was not a person until the snow accepted or rejected him. This was the test, a sacred exile called Koltanvit. The proving. Chukchi boys were sent alone into the wilderness, stripped of food, comfort, and song. The only companion was the wind, and the only hope was entrance. To survive meant more than resisting the cold. It meant listening to the spirits buried beneath the ice, to the ancestors whispering through cracks in frozen rock, to the beasts who measured a soul by its stillness. Some lasted hours. Some lasted days. A few never returned, their names wiped from memory, their spirits believed to have been devoured by dark forces. The tribe did not mourn them. To die during the ritual was not tragedy. It was truth. The earth had spoken. The boy was not worthy. But those who returned, shivering, scarred, eyes hollow with cold and vision, were greeted not with celebration, but silence. The Chukchi believed transformation should not be interrupted. Boys who survived were considered. Touched by ancestral knowledge, it was said that the strongest returned with wind in their blood, capable of sensing danger, spirit shifts, or distant storms without sight. The bone knife given before the journey became a symbol of the boy's soul. If lost or broken, it was buried separately as a warning to future generations. But if it returned intact, stained with animal blood, cracked from survival, it was passed down like a sacred heirloom. Proof of the boy's pact with the unseen. This rite was not punishment. It was purification. In a culture where even the dead must be dismembered to find peace, a boy's suffering was the beginning of truth. Pain shaped the path. Fear unlocked the door. And only those who stood alone with death, and did not blink, were given the right to speak in the council of men. Now, the cold deepens. The fire flickers in the village, and somewhere beyond the trees, another boy steps into the snow, without a name yet worth remembering. In the white silence of the Chukchi tundra, some women were never allowed to belong to men. Instead, they were chosen by elders to become Nulkavet, wives of the spirits. These women did not wear wedding beads or join in village dances. Their union was not celebrated with fire or feast, but with silence, seclusion, and submission to forces unseen. Once chosen, a girl was taken from her family and placed in a separate tent. far from the hearth and the laughter of others. There, she fasted for days until her body trembled and her voice cracked with chant. She was forbidden to touch reindeer hide, fish bones, or firewood, objects believed to carry human impurity. Even eye contact with warriors was restricted. The spirits, it was said, could become jealous. These spirit wives were trained to speak with the wind. Through ritual songs whispered into the snow, they were believed to call in herds or repel blizzards. Success meant the tribe prospered. Failure meant the woman had disobeyed, even if only in thought. Disobedience was not corrected with words, but with exile or skin branding. Hot bone pressed to thigh or forearm left silent marks that warned. The spirits she had faulted Dot to be a spirit wife was not an honor in the way outsiders might imagine. It was sacrifice, a woman's womb, her hands, her very breath, all were claimed by invisible entities. She could still marry a man later, but her first duty was always to the land and the ancient ones beneath it. If she bore children, they were believed to be part spirit, and watched closely for signs of unnatural strength or madness. The Chukchi did not ask these women to understand. They asked them to obey, to serve without question, because in a world ruled by unseen forces, those who could not hear the wind's commands were considered dangerous, and in the frozen corners of the tundra, obedience was the only shield against a world that punished those who forgot their place, even among the spirits. When the sky darkened without warning and the wind screamed across the tundra like a mourning spirit, the Chukchi did not run. They bled. Before a great hunt or in the heart of a blizzard, the elders gathered in silence, stripped to the waist despite the cold, and prepared their skin for the blade. This was not madness. It was a pact, a ritual offering to the gods of frost and storm, who demanded pain in exchange for mercy. With sharp stone or bone knives, cuts were drawn across the chest and along the back in precise, vertical lines. Each wound was placed according to ancient maps, veins believed to open the body's soul to the wind. As blood welled and dripped, the elders sang low chants in a language older than memory. These were not songs of despair, but of negotiation. With each drop, they asked the storm to turn, the reindeer herds to appear, the snow to fall slower. The blood did not fall to the ground alone. It was caught, mixed with animal fat, and burned in sacred bowls made from reindeer horn. The mixture hissed and smoked, curling into the air like a red mist. It was believed this smoke reached the wind spirits, who fed not on food, but on human will made visible. The stronger their pain, the greater the respect shown to the gods, and the more likely they were to answer. Participants often entered trance-like states, eyes rolled back, bodies swaying despite blood loss and cold. Some claimed to see visions, ancestors walking backward through the snow, spirit dogs with burning eyes, or giant hands shaping the sky. These were taken as signs that the ritual had been accepted to outsiders. It was cruelty. But to the Chukchi, pain was a language, and blood was its clearest word. In a world where weather could kill faster than war, there was no higher wisdom than knowing how to speak to the storm. The tundra did not hear words. It heard suffering. And the Chukchi gave it gladly, carving their bond into flesh, hoping the wind would listen. But sometimes the wind demanded more. In the Chukchi world, there was no figure more feared than the shaman. Warriors could end a life. Shamans could ruin a bloodline. Their power was not bound by weapons or age, but by something darker, the ability to bend fate through spirit lore. A whisper from their lips could unravel a family's future like thread pulled loose in the wind. To anger a shaman was to gamble with more than one's own life. Illnesses with no name, sudden madness, vanished children, and hunted dreams. These were signs that a curse had taken root, and once it did, It was said to cling for generations. Grandsons would limp without injury. Daughters would scream in sleep. Hunting luck would rot. Marriages would fracture under unseen weight. Some taboos were known to all. Never speak a sacred ancestor's name aloud. Never step over a shaman's drum. Never lie during a ritual. But others shifted, kept secret by the shamans themselves, passed down in bone carvings and wind-borne chants. A single mistake, one careless moment, could mark a family for decades. The curses were rarely loud. They did not rive with fire or lightning. They crept in slowly, like frost beneath skin. And once the village believed curse was real, isolation followed. No one wanted misfortune to spill. No one dared interfere. Even death did not enter shaman's reach. Their spirit was believed to linger, testing the living, watching for broken promises to this day. Some claim the land itself remembers their curses, buried deep, waiting and in the tundra, where memory freezes instead of fading. Some wounds never melt, once a year. Under a moon that flickered behind storm clouds, the Chuchi gathered to scream, not out of fear, but as ritual. In the dead of winter, when silence thickened like ice over the soul, the tribe erupted into Ra, human sound. Children, hunters, elders, all stood in open snowfields, faces tilted to the sky, and screamed until their voices cracked like frozen. Branches. This was not chaos. It was ceremony. Fires blazed at the center, fed with reindeer fat and fresh animal blood. Sizzling red over white snow, the drums never stopped. Carved from hide and bone, they pounded like a heartbeat gone mad, calling spirits from the dark edges of the world. The sound was relentless, a rising storm of agony, grief, rage, and something deeper, cleansing. The Scream Festival was believed to purge invisible sickness, disease of the body. Yes, but also sickness of thought, of spirit, of dream, anger held too long, sorrow buried too deep. All of it was meant to be vomited into the air, where it would freeze and shatter, never to return. Those who refused to scream were mocked. It meant they were hiding something, a lie, a spirit. A curse. Some were dragged forward by shamans, others were forced to bite bone charms until they bled. But everyone had to scream, even the wind. It was said, Posta listened in the Chuchi mind. Pain held in was death, but pain released, loud, terrible, honest, could save an entire village. And when the last voice broke and the drums fell silent, the snow round them held the echo of what had been cast out. And then the tundra was quiet again, almost too quiet. Cro-Magnon secrets, the brutal beliefs of prehistoric Europe's first humans long before written words and kingdoms carved their names into stone. There was a people who lived on the edge of extinction, the Cro-Magnons, Europe's earliest. Modern humans walk the icy earth not just as hunters, but as believers in things that still send a chill through time. They lived beneath cliffs and deep inside caves, surrounded by mammoths, wolves, and bone-crushing cold. But the greatest threat wasn't always outside. It was what they believed lived beyond the firelight spirits, curses, ancestors who demanded blood to stay silent. Archaeologists have uncovered human skeletons marked with violent skulls fractured, ribs pierced, joints twisted in ways that speak not of warfare, but of brutal ritual. Some were buried in crouched positions, painted with red ochre, the color of fresh blood. It was not decoration, it was belief, a symbol, perhaps, that the dead must carry life's color into the next world, or risk returning angry. The Cro-Magnons built no temples, but their caves were sanctuaries of bone and shadow, charred remains of ceremonial fires, carved stone idols. And etched animal bones whisper of a mind caught between survival and superstition. Every scrape of flint and every mark in the cave walls may have carried weight not just practical, but sacred. What little they left behind tells of a tribe that blended the physical and the spiritual in ways, both beautiful and brutal. To them, the earth was alive, the wind had voices, and the dead, if dishonored, could punish the living. Even the placement of graves suggests a strange order, some buried alone, others beneath cliff overhangs, as if sheltering them from what lies above. In some cases, bodies were decapitated, the skulls set apart as if they held a power of their own, perhaps to be guarded, or perhaps feared. They were not mindless savages. Their tools were crafted with precision. Their painted caves, buried weapons, and ceremonial items reveal a mind capable of art, memory, and myth. But their rituals silent, deadly, and ancient hint at a world ruled by fear of the unseen. This was not a peaceful tribe. It was a tribe that survived, and in their survival, they built a world of rules, punishments, and shadows that linger in stone. Because for the Cro-Magnons, to control death, one had to first understand it, and nowhere is that belief more chilling than in how they treated the dead. To the Cro-Magnons, death was not the end. It was a threshold, an invisible line crossed only through ritual, fear, and fire. And the dead were never simply gone. They lingered beneath the frozen soil of ancient Europe. Archaeologists have uncovered something haunting. Skulls buried far from their bodies, painted in red ochre and placed in precise circles, not a random act of burial, but a pattern deliberate, symbolic, and deeply spiritual. Some skulls face inward, as if called into silent council. Others rest on stone slabs, almost like offerings left to ancient forces. The red ochre is the most chilling. Sourced from earth and ground into fine powder, it was spread over bones, skulls, and even the burial pits themselves. Its color echoed, fresh blood, as if to feed a life that didn't end with breath. To Cro-Magnons, this wasn't art, it was magic, a way to color the dead back to life, or perhaps to keep them pacified beneath the ground. In some burial sites, multiple skulls appeared together without full skeletons, their original bodies missing, decomposed or used. A few researchers believe these remains could be the result of ritual sacrifice, not for punishment, but for guidance. These were not just dead relatives, they were ancestors turned guardians, feared spirits who could bless or curse. The treatment of the skull was sacred. In some cases, they were pierced, carved, or arranged to face sunrise. A belief may have existed that the skull, seat of thought and memory, retained spiritual power long after death. Keeping it close or placing it in ceremonial circles may have been a way to control that energy, or prevent it from turning violent. To live among the Cro-Magnons was to live surrounded by the dead, not just in memory, but in presence. Death was a force, raw and breathing, shaping every rule and ritual. It was not mourned. It was managed. Because in their world, the line between life and afterlife was thin, and without proper offerings, the dead might come back across it. But what if the Cro-Magnons didn't wait for death to call the spirits? What if they sought them deep inside the earth, deep within the stone lungs of the earth, far beyond sunlight and sound? The Cro-Magnons, painted, not for beauty, not for pride, but for something older, something sacred and strange. The walls of caves like Lascaux and Chauvet are covered in haunting images, bison charging, deer leaping, mammoths looming. Some are layered over one another, as if part of a ritual older than memory. These paintings are hidden in the darkest corridors, down steep drops and narrow passages, where breathing grows shallow and fire barely flickers. These places were not homes. They were sanctuaries and perhaps something more. Many of the animals drawn were not hunted. Some weren't even part of the Cro-Magnon diet. Their presence suggests symbolism, not survival. These were not just pictures. They were spells. Some scholars believe these paintings were a form of spiritual control, early attempts to trap or summon the spirits of animals. To the Cro-Magnon mind, every beast had a soul, and that soul could cross worlds. By painting it, perhaps they hoped to possess it, tame it, or beg it for mercy. The act of creation became a form of communion. The cave wall, a portal. But this connection came with fear. The deeper chambers often contain figures warped and exaggerated, horns too large, limbs twisted, eyes multiplied. They seem less like wildlife and more like visions from fevered dreams. Cro-Magnons may have believed the caves were gateways to the spirit realm, a place where the veil between worlds thinned. And what waited on the other side could see them back, echoes in the darkness. Dripping water, the flicker of torchlight, these were not background sounds. They were voices, warnings, or perhaps answers from something watching. Stepping into these chambers meant entering a space ruled by spirits and silence. One misstep, and the unseen might reach out. To paint in such a place was not an act of art. It was submission. A contract, a plea. In the Cro-Magnon world, the unknown was never empty. It breathed. It listened and it demanded. But fear of the unseen wasn't limited to caves. Sometimes it lived among the tribe itself, enforced through pain, fire, and exile. Survival in the Cro-Magnon world was a daily war against the cold, the wild, and sometimes one another. In this unforgiving Ice Age landscape, where food was scarce and warmth could mean life or death, social unity wasn't a luxury. It was law, and breaking that law came at a brutal cost. Burial sites have revealed fractured bones, crushed skulls, and signs of repeated blunt trauma injuries, not from animals or accidents, but from other humans. Some bodies show signs of starvation, while others in the same pit appear well-fed. This was not random misfortune. This was punishment. In a tribe where every fire, every fur, every scrap of meat had to be earned. Disobedience may have been seen as betrayal, and betrayal, even by blood, could not be tolerated. Deliberate isolation, banishment into the frozen dark, may have been used to enforce order. To be cast out from the group was not exile. It was a slow death. The most chilling finds are those with repeated injuries to the same part of the skull, consistent with ritual strikes, calculated, final, not acts of rage, but of judgment. It points to the possibility of execution by design, a harsh code of justice shaped not by mercy, but by necessity. In such a world, control came through fear. Elders may have enforced silence, loyalty, and submission with fire-heated stones. Starvation, all public displays of discipline, no walls, no prisons, just the cold earth and the will to survive. The Cro-Magnons didn't just endure nature. They mirrored it, ruthless, unforgiving, icy. But for the young, survival came with a different kind of trial, one that tested blood, pain, and identity, not as punishment, but as passage. In the frozen heart of prehistory, childhood did not last long. Among the Cro-Magnons, growing up was not marked by words or gifts, but by pain, blood, and survival. Becoming an adult meant earning the right to exist. And for some, that price was carved into the bone. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of adolescents bearing injuries that don't match hunting accidents or animal attacks. Instead, these marks suggest deliberate harm, controlled wounds, fractures in specific locations, and stress damage in joints still developing. These were not accidents of the wild. They were part of something older, a test. The Cro-Magnons may have believed that to join the tribe as an adult, one had to face death and return stronger. This rite of passage may have included endurance, rituals in the freezing wilderness, long hunts without food, or ceremonies involving bloodletting, fire, or silence. The pain was not punishment. It was transformation. In some cases, the bodies of these youth are found separated from family burials, laid out with tools, animal bones, or pigments. They may have been considered newly made reborn through suffering, or perhaps they never returned from the trial. Some didn't survive, and in death were honored or hidden. The young were not protected. They were sharpened. In a world where weakness invited death, childhood became a crucible. Bones tell the story of young limbs strained too soon, of scars that served as tribal proof of strength, of loyalty, of belonging. These rites weren't just tradition. They were belief, a sacred process that bound the child to the spirits of the hunt, to the blood of the clan, and to the lore of survival. Pain was the language of transformation, and silence was the sign of success. But not all rituals honored life. Some distorted it, bending the body and the soul even after death, especially when the face itself was not allowed to remain whole, buried in silence beneath layers of ash and ochre. Some Cro-Magnon skulls tell a story not of how life ended, but of what the living feared after. Faces, once human, shattered beyond recognition, not from war, not from time, but by human hands, after death. In burial sites across Europe, archaeologists have uncovered skulls bearing signs of deliberate post-mortem facial destruction. Noses broken inward, eye sockets crushed, jaws smashed with force and precision. The rest of the skeletons remain untouched, only the face is targeted. This was not chaos, it was ritual. The Cro-Magnons may have believed that the spirit lingered in the skull, and especially in the face, the mask of identity. To break it was to break the spirit's path, to trap it, or to erase it entirely. Some suggest it was done to protect the living, a final act to ensure the dead stayed dead. Others believe it was punishment, denying the deceased their place in the spirit world. This fear hints at a darker belief, that death was not silence, but potential danger, that even in the grave, power remained and it had to be controlled. The crushed face became a seal, a warning, and a final sentence. Among the Cro-Magnons, the dead were not simply honored. They were disarmed, and if the spirit could no longer see, it could no longer return. Yet the deepest mystery of the Cro-Magnon world may lie not in bones, but in silence and the rituals hidden so deep underground. Even light struggled to reach them. The tribe that mummified the living, secrets of the Doni people high in the mist-covered mountains of Papua. The Doni tribe carved their sorrow into skin and bone. Here, grief was not whispered or hidden. It was worn on the body, raw, visible, and irreversible. When a loved one died, especially someone of great respect or closeness, mourning demanded more than tears. A surviving relative, most often a woman, had a finger severed at the joint. The pain was immediate, the bleeding swift, but the meaning ran deep. This was not punishment, it was tribute, a sacrifice of the body to honor the soul that had departed. In Doni belief, intense sorrow needed a physical outlet. Without it, the spirit of the deceased might linger, restless and angry. By cutting the fingers, the living offered a part of themselves, easing the soul's journey into the afterlife and signaling the depth of their devotion. The act was also a warning to the dead. The living will not forget, and the pain of loss will echo in flesh. The amputation was done with crude stone tools or sharpened bamboo. There were no antiseptics, no anesthetics, only smoke to cauterize and ash to purify. Some women lost multiple fingers across their lifetimes, each stump a record of the deaths they endured. Children, too young to decide, sometimes had digits, cut by elder relatives to represent the family's shared loss. This ritual, known as a Kippaleen, wasn't hidden away in ancient legend. Photographs from the 20th century still show elderly Donny women with shortened, blunt fingers. Their hands, gnarled by grief and tradition, each hand told a story. Each missing piece whispered the name of someone loved and lost. But a Kippaleen was more than personal. It reflected the Donny's view of life, death, and spiritual balance. In their cosmology, everything was connected. The living, the dead, the earth, the ancestors. When that balance was disturbed by death, the living had to act. Pain became a bridge, a way to restore what had been broken. The ritual was outlawed by the Indonesian government in recent decades, but in remote corners, its memory still lingers, passed down in hushed tones and trembling gestures. Some elders still raise fingerless hands when speaking of the past. Not with shame, but with pride. They carry the dead with them, not in their minds, but in the spaces where flesh used to be. Yet the finger-cutting was only the beginning. In the Donny world, death didn't just touch the living. It stayed, watched, and waited. Some were never buried at all. Others were turned into something more permanent, something sacred, something mummified. Among the Donny, death did not erase a man. It preserved him. When a tribal elder, war chief, or revered ancestor passed away, the body was not returned to the soul. It was placed in a seated position, wrapped in sacred cloth, and set above a slow-burning fire. Day after day, the smoke thickened the skin, blackened the bones, and dried the flesh until the dead no longer decayed. What remained was not just a corpse, but a relic, a spiritual monument carved by flame. This mummification ritual could last for weeks. The fire was kept low, steady, and sacred. It was not meant to destroy, but to transform. Resin from local trees was applied to the skin, along with ochre and ash, ancient preservatives drawn from the earth. The smell of burnt wood and dried blood hung in the air. Mixing with the chants of the living, the Donny believed the soul needed time to adjust to death, and the fire served as a guide between two worlds. Once the process was complete, the mummified elder was placed inside a special hut, never buried. The preserved body remained seated, often holding weapons or tribal tools, symbols of the life once lived. Villagers would enter to speak with the dead, offer food, or seek guidance. The mummies were not memories. They were considered present. Even children were taught to respect the smoked ancestors, whose blackened faces seemed to watch in silence. The living greeted them, protected them, and feared offending them. To ignore the mummified was to risk spiritual imbalance, or worse, misfortune. One of the most famous mummies, believed to be over 250 years old, still sits in the village of Wamena. His skin is tight, leathered like bark. His eyes are hollow, but his presence commands reverence. Tourists may see a relic of a distant past, but to the Donny, he remains a tribal leader. Untouched by time, still holding power, mummification was not about resisting decay. It was about keeping power close, and where the dead walked silently among the living, war and spirit shared the same breath, because for the Donny, life was not sacred unless it could be remembered and remembered. Through fire dot in the Donny Highlands, war was not born from hatred. It was a ceremony, a rhythm etched into the heartbeat of the tribe. For generations, neighboring clans clashed in brutal but ritualized battles. These were not chaotic wars for land or conquest, but measured eruptions of pride, balance, and retribution. One stolen pig, one insulted ancestor, or one unresolved death could set entire valleys ablaze with war cries. But each battle followed an unspoken code, where even violence had its limits. Before battle, warriors painted their faces with clay and ash, transforming themselves into living spirits of vengeance. Their bodies were adorned with boar tusks, feathers, and bones. The battlefield was chosen carefully. A wide open field, never the village. Women and children watched from a distance as spears flew, arrows sliced the air, and chants roared through the jungle mist. Wounds were common. Deaths happened. But the goal was never extermination. It was expression. The fight had to reach a peak, a moment when both sides had lost just enough to feel balanced again. Only then would elders step forward and declare the fighting finished. Victory was measured not in bodies, but in bloodshed. Each drop was seen as payment toward peace. Young boys were raised in this world of sacred warfare. They were taught how to throw spears with precision, how to read an opponent's posture, and how to honor both life and death on the field. To fight was not just bravery, it was manhood. And those who fought with honor were celebrated with feathers tied to their hair, their names repeated in stories round evening fires. The Donny believed war kept the spiritual scale from tipping. Without it, grudges would fester, ancestors would become restless, and the tribe would weaken. So when pain was needed, pain was delivered, but never without ritual. And yet, even the sharpest spear dulled beside a different symbol of power, one that bled not on the battlefield, but in ritual. Among the Donny, pigs were more than livestock. They were status, sacrifice, and the currency of life itself. In Donny culture, pigs were more than animals. They were everything. A man's status, his respect, even his marriage prospects were tied to the size of his pig herd. To own many pigs was to command power, but true reverence came not from hoarding them. It came from killing them. In great rituals, pigs were slaughtered by the dozens, their screams echoing through the valleys like a call to the ancestors. The blood of pigs was believed to nourish both spirits and soul. During funerals, pigs were offered to guide the dead safely into the afterlife. At weddings, pigs were killed to bless the union and balance the energies between families. In village disputes, pig sacrifices were demanded as payment, not just to settle grievances, but to show submission, humility, or redemption. Ceremonies began before dawn. Fires were lit, stones were heated in pits, and pigs were brought in tied and trembling. The killing was swift but symbolic, often done with sharpened sticks driven into the heart. Their bodies were placed into earth ovens, roasted alongside yams, then shared among villagers. But more than food, this was sacrifice. Each pig was a message sent to the spirit world. In some rituals, the number of pigs killed was staggering. Elders say the ground once ran red with blood during death rites for tribal leaders. The more pigs a man gave, the more he proved his strength and connection to the unseen world. Among the Donny, wealth was measured not by gold, but by what one was willing to lose. And in a world where flesh was currency, and blood was a bridge to the divine, even life itself could be bought, or buried, with pigs. But behind every ceremony, another fear lingered, the spirits that could not be fed with flesh alone, spirits that whispered in the dark and stole breath in silence. Long after the fires had died and the pigs had been carved, the Donny believed something else moved through the valley, something unseen, yet deeply feared. These were not ancestors or friendly spirits. They were Mogo, shadow beings blamed for every unexplained illness, every sudden collapse, every burst of madness. According to Donny belief, Mogo crept silently through the jungle at night, flipping between huts, hunting the weak and the unprotected. They did not strike with weapons. They stole breath, slowly, invisibly. A healthy man could fall to the ground, choking on air. A child could scream in the night, eyes wide with terror, and never wake again. These deaths weren't seen as natural. They were attacks, punishments from the spirit world for a feeling to uphold sacred balance, to defend against these spirits. The Doni performed urgent protection rituals. Fire pits were rekindled. Chants filled with ancient words were spoken. Into the smoke, and the blood of small animals, often chickens, was offered to appease or drive the spirits away. Sacred herbs were burned, not just to purify the air, but to confuse the mogo, masking the scent of human breath. Spiritual leaders, known as men of knowledge, carried the burden of diagnosis. If someone fell ill, it was rarely seen as physical. It was spiritual warfare, and if the wrong spirit had been disturbed through disrespect, a broken taboo, or an unbalanced ritual, no medicine could save the victim. To outsiders, these beliefs once sounded like folklore. But in the highlands, where the line between life and spirit is thin as smoke, the Doni never questioned what they couldn't see. Because when breath vanishes without cause and silence falls too quickly, fear turns not to science, but to spirits. Yet even spirits could be forgotten. In a world reshaped by concrete, schools, and cell towers, ancient fears now stand in the shadow of fading rituals. The smoke still curls above the huts, but the chants are softened now. The Doni, once untouched by time, now stand at a crossroads between ancient ritual and modern life. Government bans have ended finger-cutting ceremonies. Tribal wars are no longer fought with spears, but settle in courtrooms. Children learn Bahasa Indonesia in concrete schools instead of warrior chants. Beneath thatched roofs, cell phones buzz where spirit drums once echoed, and yet some things remain. In quiet villages, elders still tend to the mummified, their blackened faces staring across time. Tourists come to take photographs, unaware they're standing before what was once sacred. The Doni smile politely, but behind their eyes lingers something else, a question of what will survive. Traditions are not forgotten all at once. They fade in fragments, a skipped ritual, a missing chant, a lost word, the rituals that once defined life, death, and the spirit world now flicker like dying embers. Some Doni mourn this fading. Others accept it, quietly adapting to a world that no longer bleeds for the dead. But in the highlands, memory holds on. It clings to the smoke, to the silence between stories, and to the hands that still remember how to grieve without words. Inside the Dardic tribes, the rituals they don't want outsiders to see hidden in the shadows of the Hindu Kush, where jagged peaks steer through the sky and rivers whisper like old spirits. The Dardic tribes built a world untouched by time. Here, belief is not written, it is carved into memory, passed from one breath to the next in silence. For them, silence is not absence. It is power. It is protection. It is divine. Among these isolated people, words are not used freely. Speaking aloud without purpose was once seen as a violation of balance and insult to the gods who, according to their oldest beliefs, once stole the voices of disobedient men and buried them in stone. Children learned early that the tongue could be a weapon or a curse. Newborns were not spoken to for several days after birth. It was said that the soul must first learn to listen before it learns to stay. Language itself was considered sacred property. Only elders, those who had survived hardship, fasting, and spiritual trials were permitted to speak certain phrases aloud. Some words were used only once a year during seasonal rites, and then never again until the next cycle returned. Breaking this silence brought more than shame. It was believed to summon misfortune, illness, or the wrath of mountain spirits that punished the valley with avalanches or famine. Outsiders who visited Drea, as they were often mistook the tribes, quiet for shyness or fear. But silence was not weakness. It was survival. In ancient times, it was believed that every sound made in anger fed invisible spirits known as gurs, who followed men home and poisoned their families in their sleep. To shout was to invite death. To gossip was to feed demons. Among the most feared customs was the vow of the unspoken, a punishment for betrayal. Those accused of revealing sacred knowledge to outsiders were forced to take a lifelong vow of silence. Their mouths were not sewn shut, but their names were taken from speech. No one was allowed to address them. They became living ghosts, cursed to live in full view, but never heard again. Even laughter was regulated. During mourning periods, it was forbidden to show teeth, lest the dead feel mocked and return in envy. Music, when permitted, was played, with instruments that mimicked wind or water, never drums, never horns. The gods, they believed, hated thunder made by Mandot in these valleys. Silence was the voice of devotion, fear and control. A breath could betray, a whisper could condemn, and in the hearts of the Dardic people, the gods were always listening, but when silence failed to keep order, something far more brutal took its place, the trial of fire. In the world of the Dardic tribes, truth did not rest in logic or testimony. It was summoned from flame. When suspicion crept into a village, whether over stolen livestock, adultery, or whispered curses, the elders turned to one force that never lied: fire. The ritual was simple, brutal, and ancient. There were no courts, no appeals, no defense. Once accused, a person stood barefoot before the sacred stone basin, where water boiled over a fire fed with dried cedar and animal fat. They were told to plunge both forearms in and retrieve a blessed pebble from the bottom. No delay, no hesitation. Then, they would wait in isolation after 3 days. The burned flesh was inspected by the tribal priest. If the wounds had festered, guilt was declared. If they had begun to heal miraculously, uninfected, the gods had spoken. Innocence. But healing was rare. The second version of the fire trial replaced water with stone. Glowing embers were lifted from the hearth, placed in the palms of the accused, and held there until ordered to release. The longer they endured, the stronger the argument for their truth. To scream was expected, but to drop the stone too soon meant surrendering to guilt. Refusing the trial altogether was worse. It meant a silent confession. Such people were immediately branded on the chest and shunned. They lived, but not truly. Food was denied. Doors remained shut. Mothers pulled their children away in the streets. The scars of the fire trial never faded. They marked the skin, but they also reshaped the soul. A person cleared by fire might return home, but suspicion clung like ash. Friends became distant. Marriage prospects vanished. The body may have survived, but the reputation rarely did. Some believed the ritual revealed spiritual strength more than innocence. Others whispered that those favored by the gods were simply lucky or numb with fear, but none dared speak against the fire itself. It was older than memory, older than kings. And so, fear kept justice burning. But if a soul was said to be tainted beyond even fire's reach, the punishment turned darker still when healing was replaced with burial. To the Dardic tribes, sanity was not just a state of mind, it was a sign of spiritual harmony. Any deviation from normal behavior was feared not as illness, but as invasion. A soul that trembled, screamed, or wept without cause was said to be breached by Deem. Wandering spirits that slipped through dreams and hollow trees. Madness was never seen as internal. It came from the outside, and it had to be forestepped. When someone spoke to shadows or trembled at moonlight, The elders summoned the spirit binder, a figure feared more than any priest. This was the one chosen to cleanse the possessed. The ritual began at dawn. The afflicted was stripped, bound at the wrists and ankles, and carried to a sacred field behind the village. There, a narrow pit was dug, not wide, not deep, just enough to swallow the body and leave the face above earth. For hours, the possessed were buried alive, their chests crushed by soil, their lungs heaving against weight. They were left under the sun while chants rose like smoke, reciting the names of ancient protectors and demanding the spirit's exit. Villagers circled the pit with burning herbs, covering their mouths to avoid breathing in the madness. If the buried began to thrash, it was taken as a sign the spirit was resisting. If they sobbed and begged, the chants grew louder. But if they lay still and silent, the elders whispered that the soul was returning. Some emerged half-conscious, gasping and weeping. These were seen as saved reborn, but others never emerged. If death came, the body was covered and left untouched for a day, to let the invading spirit drift away before burial. No one ever spoke of those who died in the pit. Their names were avoided, their stories left unfinished. To question the ritual was to risk being next dot in the Dardic mind. Possession was infection, and burial was the cure. Pain was a price they believed the spirit had to pay to return. But not all rituals were for those who broke inside. Some were reserved for the sin of simply being born a woman. Each month, when the moon turned pale and heavy, the women of the Dardic tribes vanished. Not by choice, but by command. Menstruation, seen not as a natural cycle, but as spiritual contamination, marked them as untouchable. They were sent to stone huts at the edge of the village crude. Windowless shelters known only as moon huts. Inside these cold, damp walls, women endured in silence. No talking, no singing, no crying. Even a scream could bring punishment. It was believed that their voices, during this time, could sour milk, rot fruit, or draw predators from the forest. If they touched a water source, rivers would dry. If they came near children, those children might sicken and die. They were given food only once per day, cold. Dry grains in a clay bowl passed through a slit in the wall. Certain foods were forbidden entirely. No dairy, no meat, no salt. It was thought these could mix with polluted blood and anger the mountain spirits. Breaking the rite brought severe consequences. Women caught speaking to each other were dragged out before the village and stripped of their headscarves, a gesture meant to disgrace. Some were tied to wooden posts for hours in freezing winds. Others were left without food for an entire cycle. The silence wasn't just symbolic, it was enforced. Girls as young as 12 were sent to the huts. They often cried their first night, not from pain, but from fear. Fear of being forgotten. Fear of the things they weren't allowed to understand. The moon huts were never cleaned. They reeked of ash, old blood, and mildew. No one dared repair them. They were meant to decay. Like the shame, they were built to contain to the Dardic people. This was not cruelty, it was protection. The world, they believed, had to be shielded from the raw power of womanhood. But isolation was not always enough. When silence and distance failed, the ancestors were called along with their bones. In the quiet corners of Dardic villages, where wind moaned through wooden beams and mountains cast long, cold shadows, skulls watched over the living, not hidden in graves, but kept in shrines lined in rows, facing east, cleaned and oiled like relics. These were not ornaments, they were family. Each skull belonged to an ancestor. Some were hundreds of years old, passed down through generations like sacred heirlooms. During specific lunar cycles, villagers gathered in silence, forming circles round the shrine. Then began the skull counting. The ritual required absolute precision. Each name had to be remembered. Each skull counted aloud, a pause, a mispronunciation, or a forgotten ancestral was seen as a grave insult. The belief ran deep. Spirits lived inside the bone. If one was ignored, it would feel shame, and that shame could poison crops, bring illness, or twist the weather against the village. Children were taught the names early, forced to memorize the sequence like Holy Scripture. Before marriage, brides were tested on their husband's ancestral line. Forgetting even one name was seen as a bad omen, a sign she would birth weak sons. But not all skulls came from kin. In whispered legends, some villages kept the skulls of enemies, especially those taken in raids. These were not honored but harnessed. It was believed that killing a strong enemy and claiming his skull passed his strength to the family. These foreign skulls were painted black, separated from the rest, and buried under thresholds or near livestock pens to ensure protection. If disaster struck a failed harvest, a child's sudden death, the elders inspected the shrine first. A cracked skull might mean a forgotten ritual. A missing one could signal theft. Accusations followed quickly, and punishments followed faster. The line between reverence and fear blurred under these bones. Love for ancestors lived side by side with dread, and so the skulls remained silent, watching, demanding. But no ritual carried more risk, more terror, than the one where peace was bought with the life of a child. When war echoed through the valleys and blood stained the riverbeds, the Dalek tribes turned not to treaties, but to children. Peace, in their eyes, was not written on scrolls, it was carved into the lives of the young. To end a feud, rival families offered their own sons or daughters in a sacred pact known as the Child Exchange. The ritual took place at dusk, beneath hanging animal skulls and smoldering incense. Elders from both clans met in silence. A blade was passed between them, and each cut their palm, letting blood fall onto the child being offered. That blood marked the child as a living contract. From that moment forward, they no longer belonged to their family. They were the property of peace. These children were raised among strangers. Some were treated well, even cherished, but others became reminders of pain surrounded by watchful eyes, denied affection, forced to erase the names they were born with. They were not adopted, they were surrendered. The belief was clear. As long as the exchanged child lived, so did the peace. If one tribe broke the pact, the child they had received was the first to die. Throats were slit before war drums beat again. It was a warning. Not an act of revenge, a message written in blood and silence. No monument marked these children. No prayers were offered in their name. They existed in the space between families, between tribes, between love and leverage. Some grew up not knowing which name was truly theirs. Others disappeared during winter raids, their deaths unspoken. Too. The Dalek tribes' sacrifice was not always about the gods. Sometimes it was about trust enforced by fear. But even these brutal bonds could not hold forever. When silence, fire, burial, and blood failed to maintain order, the only hope left was something even more sacred or more dangerous. The final secret of control lay in the unseen world, the ritual of shadows.